Welcome, everyone. This is Rabbi Nathan Zaboulani. Very excited to learn with you the commentary of Rabbi Yishak Arama, known for the name of his book, the Akedat Yitzchak. This commentary on the Torah is so fascinating, so interesting, so many novel explanations of the Pesukim, very philosophical, and at the same time, not very studied in today's day and age. And we'll see why. We'll try to rectify that a little bit through the weekly Parasha reading. Just a little bit of biographical information about him so we could better understand his perush, where it's coming from, where he learned from, what his motivations were, where he drew his information. Rabbi Yitzchak Arama was a rabbi in northern Spain. He was born in 1420 and eventually was expelled from Spain in 1492, and he dies in Naples, Italy in 1494. He was a student of Rabbi Yitzchak Kanfanton, the famous author of Darkei HaGemara. So he was steeped in Sephardic tradition, in Sephardic methodology, and he was a tremendous author, a very prolific author, but he was also a darshan. He was a community rabbi. He was a rabbi who traveled and had been in many different areas. He was in Zamora, he was in Tarragona, and he was a rabbi in Aragon. And in those communities, his students flocked and followed him wherever he went. And he would preach from the pulpit, from the stage of the Beit Knesset, and give these lengthy sermons. And this book that we are studying, his commentary, the Akedat Yitzchak, is actually a written form of his sermons that he had given over the years. A little bit about those sermons. Those sermons were actually very much inspired by the tremendous persecution that the Jews were going through at the time. Many Jews were forced, especially in Aragon, to attend churches on a regular basis and to listen to the preachers and speakers in the church that were preaching Christian theology. And in contrast to that, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama would stand up in the Beit Knesset and address a lot of the things that the Kahal was hearing, and he would teach them and educate them and arm them with knowledge and understanding of Jewish philosophy so that they could increase their emunah and understanding of what their faith really is. So the Akedat Yitzchak really has two sections to it. It starts off as the derasha part and then the hakira part. The derasha part is really like the first ever. He was the first one ever to do this. It's like a sermon. He goes in from a philosophical point of view and hooks you in and goes on a lengthy discussion that is very deep, and then we'll explain Pesukim from either Tehillim or other parts of Nevi'im or certain Midrashim, and then he'll connect it back to the Parasha. He is the first one to do this. If you look at all of the earlier commentators like Rashi and Ibn Ezra and the Radak, they all were very close to the Pesukim. They go pasuk by pasuk and are on to the text. And once in a while, they'll throw in a comment here or there that's theological or philosophical, but they're very close to the text. Rabbi Yitzchak Arama is the first to really give over an essay format. If you look at anything that we have today, like a Rabbi Sachs on the Parasha, that is really what Rabbi Yitzchak Arama is doing. He's hooking you in with a historical, philosophical topic, and then brings you in slowly to the Parasha and ties everything in. He's the first one to do this, and he was trying to strengthen the Kahal with his derashot. So that's the book Akedat Yitzchak. He brings in his introduction 4 reasons why he calls his book Akedat Yitzchak. The first reason he gives is that the word Akedah literally means to bind, the binding of Isaac. And so Rabbi Yitzchak Arama bound together all of his thoughts and derashot on the Parasha into this book that we are going to be studying. Another explanation or reason he gives is that just like Akedat Yitzchak is remembered for all generations and we refer back to it all the time, he was hoping that this commentary would be a valuable asset to all future generations that would reference it and look back to it and learn from his words. He also wrote a commentary on the 5 Megillot. He wrote a commentary on Mishlei called Yad Avshalom. And very importantly, he wrote a small philosophical book called Chazut Kasha. And this book, Chazut Kasha, interestingly, is nuanced. He very much criticizes philosophy because in his time, he saw that many of the intellectuals of the Jewish faith and also other faiths were over-relying on their understanding and over-relying on philosophy, and that corrupted them, and that weakened their emunah. And Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, who himself is constantly quoting in a positive way Harambam's Moreh Nebuchim and Aristotle and so on, he was very philosophically inclined and oriented and knowledgeable, he also was very critical of philosophy and the over-reliance of a person on philosophy without strengthening a person's emunah and the dangers of engaging too much in philosophy. So that's the book Chazut Kasha, which is very interesting, and hopefully we'll bring bits and pieces of it. But at the end of the class, hopefully we will reference this point, how Rabbi Yitzchak Arama was very nuanced in his approach to philosophy. It's important also to note that this style that Rabbi Yitzchak Arama had of writing and commentary to the Torah was really the first, and the Abarbanel very much copied his style, but also the Abarbanel copied a lot of the perushim, the actual ideas of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, incorporated into his book, and really never gave Rabbi Yitzchak Arama any credit. And there's a famous controversy that the son of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, whose name was Rabbi Meir Arama, a tremendous Talmid Chacham in and of himself, he's quoted by the Bet Yosef on the topic of Hallel, and he mentions him in great esteem. Rabbi Meir Arama sends a scathing letter, critiquing the Abarbanel, saying, how could you have taken so many of the perushim, the comments of my father, and not given him any credit? There are ways to defend the Abarbanel, but it's important to know that the Abarbanel, in his time when he came out with his perush, he was so famous and well known. There were so many printings of the book of the Abarbanel that people really thought that Rabbi Yitzchak Arama had stolen the comments of Abarbanel, not the other way around. And then, of course, they later realized that the Abarbanel had taken from the comments of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. The Chidah talks about Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, and he says how all of the Chachamim who wrote commentaries on the Torah, they all studied and looked at and learned from Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. He was a tremendous Talmid Chacham and very influential. People really studied his work. Today, it's not as well studied. It's very difficult. It's very lengthy, but it has influenced a lot of the other books that we read, that we learn without us ever even necessarily learning it. So hopefully we'll be able to glean a lot of the perushim, a lot of the chidushim that Rabbi Yitzchak Arama has on his commentary, the Akedat Yitzchak. We're going to be analyzing his comments to the first pasuk in the 3rd chapter of Bereshit, which is the deceptiveness, the slyness of the Nachash in tricking the Isha Hava. The Nachash haya arum. The Nachash was very sly, very cunning. Mikol hayat hasadeh, more so than any of the other animals. Asher asa Adonai Elohim. Vayomer el haisha, and the Nachash says to the woman, Af ki amar Elohim lo tochelu mikol etz hagan. All of the commentators are bothered by this word af. Why are they bothered? Because the word af basically means even. It's the middle of a sentence kind of a word. God said, even lo tochelu mikol etz hagan, even from all of the fruits of the tree, you may not eat. But that's a middle of the sentence kind of a word. It sounds like the Nachash is starting from the middle of a conversation, but these are the first words seemingly that he says. So Rashi explains the word differently. He says, Shema Amar Hashem. Is it true? Is it possible? Maybe. Rashi takes the pasuk and makes it into a question to avoid the problem how the word af is kind of not really fitting in the words of the pasuk. So he translates it as, perhaps God said that you can't eat from any of the fruits of the tree. The Ibn Ezra takes a different approach, and he says, that this pasuk is really in the middle of a conversation, that the Isha and the Nahash were engaging in a conversation, and then the pasuk and the Torah doesn't tell us everything that they spoke about. It only tells us the ending of their conversation because it pertains to the story that we are about to read of the sin of the Eitzadat. And so that's the way Abarbanel the Ibn Ezra says. He says that this is the middle of a conversation. We don't know what was said beforehand. This is only the ending of what they're saying, and that's why you have the word af, a word that really doesn't belong in the beginning of a conversation. Now we're going to see the commentary of the Akedat Yitzchak, who brings Rashi and brings Ibn Ezra, disagrees with them, and then brings his novel approach. Says Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, what I see fit is it's very funny what he says over here. He says that really the sentence that the Nachash says over to the Isha is incomplete. but not incomplete the way that the Ibn Ezra explained it, rather incomplete that it's the beginning of a sentence, but he's cut off by the Isha because, as he says, that women are accustomed to speak very quickly and to interrupt a person as they're speaking. So the Isha interrupts the Nahash mid-sentence, and that's why the sentence to us doesn't really make sense grammatically, and is difficult to understand in that way. He goes on and explains, Ela shelo he speak like more. He wasn't able to finish what he wanted to say before the Isha interrupts him. The Isha jumps in to argue on him, and only afterwards the Nahash finishes what he has to say. So let's look at these Pesukim in the full context of the Perek and try to see what's going on over here. Essentially, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama says that you have to link together the first thing that the Nahash says and the second thing that the Nahash says as though it is one full sentence that is interrupted by the Isha. Now you'll see the words of the Nahash here in green, interrupted by the words of the Isha in blue, and then resumed back again in green. And you have to read the green almost as one flowing sentence, one pasuk that gets broken up into two, that gets interrupted by the Isha. So let's see it the way Rabbi Yitzchak Arama sees it. והנחש היה ערום מכל חד השדה שעשה אדוני אלוהים ויאמר אל האישה אף כי אמר אלוהים לא תאכלו מכל עץ הגן. Continue on to the end of pasuk Daled, lo mot timutun. When you read it this way, it means even if God had told you that you should not eat from any of the fruits of the trees of the field, lo mot timutun, you're not going to die from it. So now this way, what the Nahash is saying is not a very extreme thing. He's saying, yeah, God may have told you that you shouldn't eat from the fruits of the field, but even if you do, you're not going to die. Since the Isha interrupted him mid-sentence, what ends up being is the Nahash is saying something very inflammatory, very extreme, because now it means God told you you can't eat anything. And the Isha interrupts him mid-sentence and says, no, we can eat from the fruits of the tree. She interrupts him, she argues on him, and because of the inflammatory, very extreme kind of a way that the Nahash says it, even though, right, in the full context, he's not saying anything really extreme. So Rabbi Yitzchak Arama explains why all of this is true. Why did this happen? He says, the Nahash was very arum. He was very sly. He was very cunning and had a whole master and devious plan that you never would have imagined. Essentially, before we read it, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama explains that this is a case of extremism that breeds extremism. And this, one of the first stories that are mentioned in the Torah, there are many things that happen in the beginning of the days of man. But the Torah is recording for us matters which are important for every human being to understand, especially a reader of the Torah, to understand the psychology, the nature of human beings in this world. And that is, says Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, that when an extreme action, behavior, or approach takes place, it is common for the spectators who are not invested to run to the opposite extreme. Extremism breeds extremism, and you see this today all the time in religion, in politics of the United States. But not to get too political, we're going to give an example coming off the cuff of Simchat Torah. If you have a mother who watches what goes on in Simchat Torah, kids go to the Beit Knesset, they get these candy bags, and they're eating 75 candies throughout the day. She's sending her son for the first time to Beit Knesset, and she obviously doesn't want this extreme behavior to be done by her child. So she goes to the opposite extreme. We can all see this happening. She says to her child, you're not allowed to eat even one piece of candy. If you eat even one piece of candy, you're going to throw up and get very sick. The kid got sick maybe 6 months ago with a stomach virus. He does not want to go through that again. So he goes to the Beit Knesset and he's very weary of eating any candy. He's listening to the very extreme approach of his mother that says you can't eat any candy. It's not balanced. It's not normal. It's not eat 2 or 3. The kids are eating 75. He's not allowed to eat any. One extreme breeds another extreme. And we're going to see, obviously, what the problem with that is. The problem is that when the kids are playing around and they're eating that candy, and the child sees how everyone's eating candy and they're all fine and they're all offering him, he's wary at first, but when he sees that everything is okay, even though they're eating the candy, he says, well, I guess it's okay. And then he eats one and he eats two, and then he ends up eating 100. Because once he sees that after he ate one, everything was fine, what his mother said wasn't true anymore. And now there are no barriers and no boundaries and no restrictions to what he's going to do. So the same thing over here. Yishak Arama says that the Nachash wanted to trip up the Isha. He wanted her to sin. And so he goes in one extreme, expecting the Isha to interrupt him and expecting the Isha to go to the other extreme, as he says, derech haflaga diber shetilached bo. He trapped her. He said, you can eat from all of the fruits of the tree. Why are you restricting yourselves? Eat from everything. Now, in contrast to that, she says, what does she say? She says, no. I can't eat from the Etz Hada'at or touch the Etz Hada'at. She goes to another extreme. She becomes too restrictive while the Nachash was trying to be too permissive. He goes in the extreme and says, do whatever you want. She says, no, I can't eat from the Etz Hada'at and I can't touch it. The problem is that Borei Olam only said that you cannot eat from the Etz Hada'at. He never said that you cannot touch it. And as the Midrash and Bereshit Rabbah explains, that the Nachash ends up pushing the Isha into the tree. She bumps into the fruit. And once she's fine, the Nachash says, look, you said that you can't touch it or else you would die. And look, you touched it and you're fine. If you touched it and you're fine, certainly you can eat it and you will be fine as well. And in this way, the Nachash, the cunningness of the Nachash, trapped Chava in a battle of extremism. He went one direction, and that motivated and pushed Isha to go in another extreme in her mind. And as we know from the Torah, Lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu. You're not allowed to subtract from the Torah. That makes a lot of sense. But you're also not allowed to add to the Torah. Why shouldn't you be allowed to add to the Torah? The reason is because when you add to the Torah, you dilute the inherent value which is embedded within the Torah, and all of the fences that you now created now are becoming confused and ambiguous and diluted. You don't know what's the real truth to the Torah and what becomes the fence. And when you fall into that trap, as soon as the fence is broken down and everything is okay, you assume all the other laws can be broken down as well. In fact, it is a mitzvah in the Torah that you are not allowed to confuse a derabanan to a deoraita. The fences are okay to be made, but you must distinguish between the fence and the ikar, the mitzvah, the Torah. The Nachash trapped Chava in confusing what was real, what was the law, and what was the fence around the law. And as we're starting reading the Torah, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama is telling us that this first message that the Torah is giving you is you're reading this Torah, you're reading these laws, you must keep these laws. But you have to make sure that any fences that you create around those laws to uphold it and to keep it, you have to make sure that you do not confuse, that you do not mix between the two. You must distinguish between the two so that if a fence falls, at least the Torah will remain intact the way it is, and that you'll be able to keep it in the right way. One extreme breeds another extreme, but we can never forget what the emet, what the truth, what the ikar is. Thank you very much for joining us in studying the philosophical, methodological approaches of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. As we mentioned at the beginning of the class, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama had a very nuanced approach to philosophy. He himself saw how philosophy was corrupting the people. They were going in an extreme, an over-reliance on the study of philosophy. But Rabbi Yitzchak Arama stayed true to his word. He taught us in this week's Parasha that when one extreme can breed another extreme, you do not have to fall victim to that extreme. You could be nuanced in your approach. And so he was critical of philosophy, but he himself remained faithful to emunah, to his belief in Borei Olam, and to the study of wisdom that was around him. He did not go to the other extreme and completely bash and prohibit and forbid the study of philosophy like many other rabbis in fact did, but rather he was nuanced in his approach. And I think that's his message for this week's parasha. There may be some crazy ideas out there, but that does not mean, and you must protect yourself from those crazy ideas, from those extreme ideas, but that does not mean that you should suffer and react in an extreme way as a result. Thank you very much for joining us. Please come back and learn with us. Rabbi Yishak Arama, the Akedat Yitzchak on Parasha Noach. Have a great day.